Hello, hello. Good afternoon. It's Thursday afternoon at 4 o'clock, so it must be time for another teissTalk. I'm your host, Jeff White. We're here every Tuesday and Thursday, 4 p.m. live with all of the top topics in tech security. Hello, welcome back. If you're joining us again, our regular viewers, we always love to have you here. And hello, welcome to you. If you're a new attendee, please do spread the word about teissTalks. We get through all of the key topics with all of the best panelists. The talks are all archived online, so if you do want to catch up with any of them, you can go to the teissTalk website and catch up with any of them there. But I'm glad to have you joining us live. It's great to have you all here. It's been a bit of a distressing week for me. I had my bicycle stolen on Friday. I say I had my bicycle stolen on Friday. It sounds like I requested the stealing of it. But no, the bike was stolen and I managed to get it back, which is a long and involved story that sometime perhaps I will tell you here on teissTalk. But it was particularly traumatic. And I've been thinking a lot about bike theft subsequently. And look, there's nothing the police, yes, were very annoying and didn't do much, but ultimately this is not a theft or a rape or a murder or something like that. It's a theft. So I get the police aren't exactly bothered. Frankly, these are low-level petty criminals. So that's how this goes. I just want to show you something, which is this is the ABUS SteelerFlex 1000 lock. This is a gold-rated, sold secure lock, and it's motorcycle-proof, motorcycle lock. And this is what they did to it. Remarkably, that, by the way, is the link that they went through. You can see probably that is an angle grinder cut, because apparently they now have battery-powered angle grinders, which the blade on them is, 3 inches long? So as long as your lock is no longer than 3 inches, which of course this lock is, they can just go straight through it. And there is no lock on the market that is apparently angle grinder proof, and so every bicycle is vulnerable. So there is only one thing we can do about bike theft. Every bike has to be registered. If you register the bikes, the police can at least get them back and confiscate them once they find them. But if you're buying a secondhand bike and anyone's selling a secondhand bike, the expectation should be that it's on Bike Register, which is the police-approved bike registration scheme. So I'm gonna post a link to Bike Register in the chat, and I'm going to give the free teissTalk mug to whoever registers their bike during the course of this teissTalk. So there you go. You can get a free teissTalk mug if you join the revolution and register your damn bike on Bike Register, because the only way we're going to stop these bastards. Sorry, there we go. Rant over. Listen, it's great to have you here on our teissTalk. I will now get to the topic in hand, which is a very, very piquant and in the news topic. We're talking about supply chain thefts and supplier insurance, the gnarly topic of supplier insurance, one that's come up on various of our teissTalks. I know you guys will have opinions of it, and you folks will have opinions. If you do, please drop them in the chat. We also have the Q&A function, so you can ask our guests and questions. And also, please stick your comments and questions in the chat there. Simon says, thanks, Jeff, for the bike register lock. No problem, Simon. Get your bike registered. I am going to introduce our panel. Later on, we'll be hearing from Mark Avery, who's Chief Information Security Officer and founder at Cyberchain Alliance. And we're also going to be hearing from Mike Campfield, who's Vice President, General Manager, International Operations and Global Security Programs, Extra Hop. Good long job title there for Mike. I'm going to talk to our first guest now, though, who's Ed Hardy, who's Senior Vice President, Cybersecurity at Alex Partners. Are you there, Ed? Can you hear us?
I am, yes.
Good.
Sorry to hear about your bike. I've been there. I've had 3 motorbikes stolen. It's about 1 a year.
I was going to ask, because I knew you were a biker from your profile, and I was going to ask about this. So how do you mind me asking the circumstances? Did they go through the lock, or was there some other?
So they come into the secure underground storage under my block of flats with an angle grinder. And last time with a gun, and the doorman and the security spot them, and of course they wave a gun, and quite correctly they don't get involved.
What?
And whatever I put on it. So last time it was about £1,000 worth of locks they cut through, and it was the best locks, chains at the military, everything, and it's just you can't. And we always get them back because they all have trackers, but they're generally a write-off.
Yeah. And that's the issue. Presumably, you hopefully get it back from the insurance or whatever, but...
It is, and then I had to take a break from motorbikes for a year because, quite rightly, nobody in there with any sense would insure me.
Is that right? Yeah. Unbelievable. And this is the thing, you suffer in that way. So I'm sorry for your loss, Ed, in that case, and good luck being back on the bike. least with bicycles, I mean, the idea of storing it outside now does not appeal. I'm storing it inside, so that's how I'm hoping.
And it stops you using it. So I've got push bikes, and I wouldn't ride them to the shop because it won't be there when I come out.
Yeah, it's troubling, very, very troubling. I think my conclusion with this is, because this block I've had that for 10 years. I've used those for 10 years, and no one's got through it. And it was outside for months, and nobody touched it. And I thought, well, okay, this is great. The lock is obviously good. If you leave it in one place for long enough, they'll clock it and they'll work out how to get through it. So taking it to the shop and leaving it there for half an hour and coming out, they've not got time enough to clock it and work through it.
Yeah.
So I feel okay about that. It's locking it outside overnight for any length of time. I think is the issue.
It is, and of course the flip side is they must get so little for it if they sell it or they strip a motorbike for parts versus what it costs you to replace or to get it in the first place.
Well, yeah, long story on that. This guy put the bike on Gumtree and was selling it for 450 quid. So he was actually making a fair amount out of it. So yeah. But listen, anyway, onto the topic in hand and also onto yourself. Alex Partners, tell us a little bit about Alex Partners for those who.
So we're our reputation is we started out as a restructuring company. So when companies were in distress, we're the people who would help get them out of distress and restructure the company and bring them back to life. But since then, we've expanded. We're about 2,500 last time I checked, but I suspect it's more. And it's all about sort of management and strategy. So there's the restructuring business, but there's also a big digital arm where I work, which is I'm in the cybersecurity bit, but you need to use digital technology. You need to retool your environments. You need to, how do we restructure to make the business go forward? And we like to sort of target ourselves as the people for when it really, really matters, when it's going to keep your business going or take your business to the next level. We're the people who love to go in and do that pretty much anywhere in the world.
And are you, just to be clear, I'm always confused by this, but are you doing cybersecurity for Alex Partners or for Alex Partners' clients and
for their customers? So
okay.
It's everything from somebody wants to buy a company. Can I come in and look at the due diligence and go, well, the cybersecurity is brilliant, or there's a lot of risk there. You need to do something about it and talk about the price. Through to you own this company. Here's a strategy. We'll analyze it, and then here's a 3-4 year roadmap to get you back to where you should be.
Right. Okay.
And the really fun bit is targeting it at risk. So we're not that interested in talking about the technology or the little servers with flashing lights. It's what is the business value? There's what is your tolerance for risk, and actually linking cybersecurity to that. So it shouldn't be seen as a tax. It should be seen as this protects you and it adds value.
Well, that's the thing I was going to ask. In the wake of the sort of Verizon, Yahoo takeover, which obviously was the sort of piquant example of a company being revalued, should we put it kindly, in the wake of a cybersecurity issue. To what extent now are, in terms of mergers and takeovers and valuations, to what extent is cybersecurity taken into account, and are we clear now on the valuations around it?
It's taken into account in virtually every instance I see these days, because they understand the impact. They've seen it happen to big companies. And there's also, of course, there's the big scary bits of law like GDPR and breach reporting requirements around the world, where they understand if this goes wrong, it's a reputational issue, it's a financial issue. And a lot of it's interestingly driven by the sort of non-execs who come into these boards and will ask challenging questions about it. But one of the ways you look at it is by sort of looking at the impact and going, well, if this goes wrong and you lose all this data, it's going to cost you £10 per record or whatever it is. Right, You've got 15 million records. Spending 100 grand to fix it, it's a deal.
Yeah. No, interesting. Yeah, even I can do that maths.
Absolutely.
Good stuff. And by the way, I noticed actually, I was going to say on your CV also, you've trained at the London School of Coffee, I notice. I
did, and I left that on there because everyone confuses it for the London School of Economics. I've had a bunch of interviews where people have asked about that, but
right.
I like doing silly stuff just for the fun of it. It's
I think, to be honest, that training is probably more valuable and certainly in more regular use than anybody's training at the London School of Economics. I think that's the.
I couldn't possibly comment, but it's one of the many silly adventures I like to go on.
Fantastic. Well, listen. Let's have a chat about the topic in hand, the supply chain stuff, because it is really interesting, and we're going to be talking obviously about reputational damage and also valuation and so on in terms of that. But there's been our Tice Elf who beavers away in the background and helps us out here on Tice Talks wonderfully, has put in a link to London School of Coffee if anybody fancies trading there. But also this story appeared in the news last few days. Labour Party data breach. Supporters' details affected in cyber attack. Ed, did you see this one? What did you make of this?
I did, and it's no great surprise. Why would you, if you're a bad guy, why would you attack and you wanted to target somebody? Why would you attack them when you can just go down the food chain, down the supply chain, and find the weak link? And that's especially true of organisations that are not necessarily technical driven, who just want IT to work, and it's easy for them to just go and buy it. It's, and also, frankly, as an attacker, if I could attack one supplier and then get all their customers, it's vastly more efficient. We keep seeing this, and it's everything from traditional supply chains like this through to using somebody else's code on your website. They're all routes in.
What I found interesting about this was when we talked about supply chain issues before, as we have a lot, post SolarWinds and Kaseya and so on. My sort of sense for it, I've always been thinking through the prism of you're supplying services, a piece of software, like the SolarWinds thing, a piece of software is sitting on your system and so on. What's interesting, this Labour Party thing sort of gets into the territory of suppliers of data, and you supplying, in that way, I suppose you could argue the Labour Party was the supplier of the data to the person, the party who got hacked. But equally, somebody could be sitting on your data and helping you process it or manage it. And so there's a supply, not just of services, but a supply of data going on, I think.
Absolutely. And we've seen, there was another example of this, I can't remember their name. They supplied fundraising software to a lot of the universities and charities. And, that's, again, it's impacted everyone. So it's even impacted me as, I was a student at UCL. My data's in there. And it's, this data is being moved around because data is expensive and complex to process, and you want to get your value out of it. So they're passing it back and forth. It's interesting. Of course, they have the liability. It's even if your supplier might have a contract, it's your fault. It's your problem.
Yeah, it's interesting with this. I mean, the Sky article, and by the way, Alexander Martin was one of the names mentioned on there, as also their political correspondent. But if you don't follow Alex Martin on Twitter, you should do. He's a good guy. I think quite a good journalist at Sky, I think, for my money. But he's the article talks about this being a ransomware attack on the party that was holding the Labour Party's data, which again is really interesting because it doesn't, the data's not necessarily been stolen. We don't know. There's lots of conjecture. But if it is a ransomware attack, it's been rendered unusable, and so Labour sort of been pulled into this thing where, because a supplier has been hit with ransomware and that the data's been scrambled, the Labour Party then gets hit because they have to report because their data that they gave to that third party is no longer available. So it's really interesting, again, from that supply chain issue, data, ransomware and supply chain all coming together. It's a clusterfuck.
And if it goes wrong, how do you untangle that? Because do you believe the supplier when they say no data's been lost? Do you even have the contractual right to send your own forensics teams and your own investigators in? And do you have the capability to do that? And what happens if this happens and the suppliers don't disclose it? So it's it's really, and that some of those contractual conditions are always missing. Ideally, you'd have the right to go, right, we're sending a forensics team. We want to see this.
Interesting as well that if the third party, and let's take it away from the Labour example, just so that we're not speculating too much about this, but if there's an example like this, if the third party who is holding the data did have a ransomware incident and didn't report it to the ICO, but then the people whose data they were holding found out about it and did report it, that's going to be a lot of hot water for the people holding the data, because suddenly the ICO is like, well, hang on, why are we finding out about this from those guys over there, not from you directly? It's interesting.
Absolutely. And some people will make the decision not to report because as much as they are required to, it'll be, well, if we don't, you sometimes find people who don't want to know when it's happened because then they don't have to report it. But absolutely, if somebody reports it and the other party doesn't, that's a problem. If the people doing the ransomware chose to report it or publicize it,
that's true. Yes. Yeah.
It raises the prospect of if you don't pay me, I'm going to tell the ICO on you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I just think it's fascinating. As I say, it's a whole new sort of side to the supply chain issue that I haven't really fully clocked, because my sense for the supply chain issue was supplying of services. If you add data to that supply chain issue, suddenly the entire data chain, all the outsourcing of data processing and so on starts to be pulled into this. And you start, for me, then you start to have the same conversations and the same issues as we've seen with the kind of supply chain attacks, with the kind of supply chain of data. It's really interesting.
Absolutely. And of course, the key bit being it's a chain. So you might pay company A to process your data, but you tend to find they're using software written by company B and services from company C, and it goes on. So you're never entirely sure who's actually looking at your data and what they can do with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really interesting. By the way, our teissTalk has pointed out this is our first non-PG-13 episode, because I did swear earlier on. Sorry, I slipped out. I'm obviously in a sweary mood. My bicycle being stolen, I'm obviously in a sweary mood. But listen, I want to bring in our other panelists on this and see what their thoughts are. I'd like to be joined by Mark Avery, who's CISO and founder at Cyber Chain Alliance, and Mike Campfield, who's Vice President, General Manager, International Operations and Global Security Programs at Extra Hop. Hello to you both.
Good afternoon.
Good. Mark, let's go to you first then on this Labour Party story. What did you make of it?
I think it, as Ed quite rightly said, it's not a surprise. I mean, I think many organisations have suffered something similar, and maybe should have learned a lesson. I think that's one of the key things here, is that we need to start learning these lessons and not making assumptions about how protected our data is. And that, for me, is the crux of supply chain management, really. It's about paying attention to what matters to you, and not necessarily trusting that third party that you've got a relatively generic services agreement with are going to protect it as much as you want them to. And I think it's really upon the organisations, as I say, just to make sure and pay attention to what matters to them. I think that the data exchange one is I guess, unique. There's a question around lawful purpose of processing under GDPR, and whether or not that company had lawful purpose for storing that data. We don't yet know what data it was, but it's sufficiently personal for them to report it to the ICO. And there's a question about whether or not they needed all of that information. Did they protect it? Were they asked to protect it in a particular way, etc.? So it's interesting.
And it's true. And just to be fair to the Labour Party and to this story, we don't know. We actually don't know what kind of data it is. As you say, it's important enough for it to get reported. We're not sure what the contractual arrangements were, what it actually was. And also, interestingly, of course, Mark, we don't know who we're talking about the third party company holding the data. We know it's the Labour Party, but we don't know them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think hopefully they know who it is.
Yes. In trouble if they don't. Yeah. Mike, can I come to you on this? Obviously, joining us from overseas, over the pond, but obviously this is an issue that goes beyond just the UK and the Labour Party and so on. I mean, US political parties are sitting on massive amounts of data, and high net worth individuals as well. They fundraise from. It must be an issue as well for political parties, I'd imagine, overseas.
Certainly is, and when you look at just whether it's this issue or any data ownership problem. Knowing your supplier, number one, is certainly important. And obviously, there are a lot of rules like GDPR that you do have to take careful consideration around where that data is and who can look at it, who can process it. And when you look at the way most of these companies, like a Labour Party or anybody dealing with even our software, kind of go through this due diligence, a lot of times it is contractual kind of due diligence as opposed to security control due diligence. And when you look at a third party data breach like this, I think you really have to start assessing the criticality of where you're outsourcing your data to, or how you're providing access with that, and really go beyond the actual contractual process and start lifting up the covers.
Yeah, it's interesting. Mike, I mean, staying with you in the US, there's an interesting reputational element to this as well, because I'm thinking if the Labour Party or Labour Party politicians in the future started to talk about data security, it would be a cunning journalist who would say to them, well, hang on, didn't you have an incident? I'm thinking in the US, obviously with the Biden administration, doing good things, doing good things about cybersecurity, or at least making good noises about it and ransomware and so on. Well, obviously, it's a reputational issue. If the Democrats' data go, if they had a similar incident, it'd be quite a bit of a blow. It'd be a bit of an embarrassment, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, going way back in time, think about the Trump versus Hillary Clinton thing with all those emails that happened. So, there's a lot of history around embarrassment around data access for sure.
Yeah. And that's interesting, because I mean, Trump, one of the things that Trump did during the campaign was he constantly kept hitting Hillary Clinton for that sort of leak of emails and the security, and it sort of weakens this idea that you're not a strong politician because you've lost this data. I think that was roughly speaking, his argument.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah. Ed, can I come back to you on this? Because obviously the issue is about supplier assurance and trying to do all of this. I mean, I'm sure, and not making any specific things about Alex Partners or so on, but my sense is that the number of questionnaires going out in the wake of SolarWinds and Kaseya has ramped up. Surely that there's just been more questions asked. Have I got that right?
And the issue is the quality of the questionnaires. So there's a lot of generic questions which sometimes verge on the, do you do security? Oh, great, thanks. And sometimes they are run by the wrong people. So sometimes they are technical questionnaires which are sent out by the purchasing department, who don't really have the capability to process them. I've absolutely seen places where they've got technical responses which would set off red flags elsewhere, but they've basically got, well, we don't have a sheet that goes, that's bad. So they don't know how to do it. But absolutely, lots of questionnaires, lots of interest. But also there's, to take one of Mark's points, knowing who your supplier is also, it sounds ridiculous, but especially in big companies, they don't often have a complete list of all the suppliers with access to data. And it's not uncommon that you'll go on site and find somebody's used a company credit card to buy something that processes data, to buy a tool on a website. And sometimes it's these little ones that are, sub $2,000, but you suddenly find they've got all the data as well. And they sometimes you find that there's a whole ecosystem of sort of dark IT where they bypass any of the controls and the systems we try to implement.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mark, has that been your experience as well? Because I think Ed raises a good point of like the lower level stuff is potentially the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I think it's upon us to just recognise the context here, and that this problem isn't going away. Obviously, we don't know any details about the Labour incident, but what we have witnessed is indiscriminate attacks. And it may well be that they just got lucky. They may just have stumbled upon the fact. They may not necessarily have been targeting Labour Party supply chain. And it's just this indiscriminate nature of attacking organisations at the moment. And yes, they hit the jackpot on certain occasions. But these organisations are well funded. Ever since ransomware was a thing, money has been changing hands quite rapidly. I think I read something this morning that in the first half of 21, allegedly the Revel ransomware group made something around $100 million from collecting ransoms. So they are much better funded than any of our security functions, and so that's the challenge that we're facing. But I think one of the challenges that we have is that, as Ed mentioned, there's a number of reluctances and a number of reasons why it's difficult to get supply chain assurance. The first thing is time, right? As Ed mentioned, it's easy now to go and get a cloud solution that provides a business capability that you really, really need and helps your team go faster. Online collaboration tools, etc. And have you really got time to slow down that project and that business innovation for the sake of security coming in and doing some diligence on a company that may be in Israel or somewhere else? It's really difficult to do. So I think the risk assessment element of it then comes into play. Well, how much of a risk is this for us? And these thankless tasks of sending out questionnaires just doesn't work, unfortunately. It's not necessarily a bad step. It's a step in the right direction. But as I say, it can be a thankless task, and you don't necessarily get the right level of assurance from that type of process.
So for you, Mark, what do you think would be? I mean, it's putting quite a lot of weight on your shoulders, but what do you think would be a better solution? Is there some things that you've seen that you think works better or would work better?
Yeah, I think as was already mentioned, looking at the risk of each and individual service that you're outsourcing, looking at the data, and constantly asking the question, what if this goes wrong? What if I choose the wrong supplier? What if I choose the wrong piece of software to put into my network and give it admin privileges so it can see and do everything in the network? What could go wrong, and what would I need to do differently? So this isn't so much about supply chain assurance. It's upon the individual organizations to take responsibility about what's really important to them. I think that's the first starting point for me. Everything else kind of follows on afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, Mike, that sounds, what Mark said there sounds quite sensible, Mike. I don't know, is that being applied, or do you see people, as Ed said, sticking to the sort of rigorous questionnaires or not so rigorous questionnaires?
Yeah, I think it's more of the latter. I think that there's a great trend of it getting better in certain areas. And just to completely agree with Mark, it does start with a cyber program resilience. You're looking at where your connective tissues are, what are the impacts there, and really segmenting that out and graduating how deep of a forensic deep dive do you do there, because you can't really put the X-ray on each vendor that you have 100%. You have to kind of graduate it from that perspective. And so the ones that are touching your data or critical assets or have connective tissue inside of your enterprise, these are the places where you really have to run through your cyber resilience program. Going back to SolarWinds, one of the best practices was don't put security endpoint software on the SolarWinds server. That sounds ridiculous, right? For something that would be inside of your network and monitoring all of your network transactions, and you just have to stick to your guns from a security best practice perspective.
That's interesting, Ed. Can I put that one to you then? Do you think that's a conversation people should have had with SolarWinds, and how do you think that conversation would have gone then?
I think it's a conversation the end using companies should have had. Going, not likely. No, if you're telling me that I need to do this to break my security model, to install your security tool, there's something fundamentally broken there. And we either need compensating controls. If you really insist we have to do this, we need another layer of controls, something else, or we need to go and look at other suppliers. That's a really difficult conversation, because unless you've got top table buy-in from the CEO. If you've already got this tool, if you come in as a new CISO and they're a SolarWinds house and it's been there for 5 years and they've got a lovely account manager, it's quite difficult to say we need to spend a lot of money to change.
And Ed, couldn't it be the point as well that it didn't start that way, but over time you sort of trust it, and then it gets to the point where say actually it'd work better if you switched off that monitoring? Absolutely,
and that highlights a really big problem of people tend to do single point assessment. So we're going to assess you before we put you on the payment system, and then maybe we'll do a very light touch if you're lucky once a year. But of course, company security goes up and down, and this absolutely needs to be. I'd be amazed if in some organisations the SolarWinds thing isn't in minutes from risk boards going, they've told us to do this and it breaks our risk model, and somebody's had to make the decision going, well, what's the worst risk? Stop using SolarWinds, that's a year's project, or use an old version of SolarWinds, which presents us with risks, and trying to balance that decision. It's a really bit of complicated bit of maths.
Yeah. But Mark, this comes to your point about going around your suppliers and so on, how and that sort of constantness of it. Organizations, you can't be constantly every single day reviewing your suppliers and so on. Is there a sort of middle ground of, maybe not a year, but maybe not every day? How do companies make that decision?
I think so. I mean, I've seen, I'm not going to name any suppliers here, but I've seen those 200 question spreadsheets that get sent out. And most of it, the vast majority of it, is irrelevant to the service that they're providing. In the example of the Labour Party, it may well be there's just a handful of questions that need to get asked. They're probably not interested in physical security, so why ask them about it? They should be interested in incident response plans and things like that. So it's about focusing on what's necessary and going and getting the relevant type of assurance for that particular service that you're doing. And the other thing that just kind of sprung to mind is that Traditionally, we spend a lot of time. Procurement teams spend a lot of time trying to find appropriate suppliers, be that for security products or otherwise. And the security team are often on hand to try and help make sure that there's appropriate security within the products or the services. But when we've kind of dwindled down a short list of 10 suppliers down to 2 or 3, we cast away everything else and choose one supplier. Why is there not a consideration for alternate suppliers if and when something goes wrong? You've done all of the hard work. What about supplier B? When could they possibly? Can we use them as resilience at some point in the future?
Interesting.
Not just software, but services. Manual labor, whatever it is. Let's think about resilience from that point when we are actually doing some good work, but make sure that that's through the rest of the organisation as well.
No, that's a good tip. That I think it might be worth actually. I wonder. Should we try and do a poll on that? I wonder whether we can try and get a poll. Our teissTalk can help us with a poll occasionally. If I ask him nicely. So I guess the question in the poll would be: do you keep suppliers as a backup if they don't make it in the first round? I guess that would be the topic of the poll. So it'll appear in a little polls thing next to your Q&A. So pop in there and cast your votes, please. I'd be interested to hear whether people, because that's a very smart suggestion from Mark. I'm just wondering whether people actually use it and actually do it.
I never said it was easy, by the way.
Okay. Ed, sorry, Ed.
One thing I just want to is this is often seen as a confrontational relationship. So you are there to beat up your suppliers, and there is this horrific thing in the security industry of enjoying finding fault with other people. The best schemes I have seen are the ones who go, okay, so we've looked at your external security and this worries us and this worries us. Let's help you. Do you want to speak to one of our network guys who's really good at sorting out SSL configuration? And we'll lend him to you for an hour. And when you build up that relationship and that trust where they can come to you going, look, you've asked for this, we don't quite know how to do it, and we give you 3 months under certain conditions. And that's how you maintain, because what you really desperately want is them to ring you up going, something's happened, and tell you, or we're worried about this, and get advice. So moving away from it being a sort of an exam into a teaching thing almost.
No, yeah,
I think that's a really good suggestion, actually. Just to highlight that point. Sorry, Mike, you carry on.
I was just going to say, being a technology provider in security, I can give you our point of view. I would tell you that when we get those kind of partnership discussions, whether we can meet a certain control or not, or get halfway there, we're always looking to meet our customers where they're at and what they need. We don't have enough of those discussions as far as kind of in the weeds of, hey, we're in for example, a PCI environment, and we noticed you're doing X, Y, and Z. Can we talk about that? And we're always, as a vendor, happy to have that discussion with a customer and understand their requirements more.
And it's to everyone's advantage, because as the buyer, if your security is better and you're more comfortable, I'm safer. So
exactly.
I have seen some wonderful examples where people, even things they hold a 6 monthly conference with all their suppliers about security, get them in a room, get them some food, start going, who's using this? And interestingly, they find they're assessing the same suppliers. Suppliers have suppliers, and they sort of link it all together.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our poll, by the way, do you keep suppliers as a backup in case they don't make it in the first round? No, by 67%. 33% say yes. So maybe, I don't know, it might be worth keeping those emails handy of the ones you turned down. The topics you guys were talking about, the subject you're talking about, then ties in with the question we've had from Daniela, who's asked, how specific or stringent are you during the RFP stage to avoid the smoke and mirrors some vendors throw at the business, then failing to be secure after the signature? Ed, can I ask you about that one first?
So it's tricky. If you're incredibly stringent in the RFP, you will scare off some suppliers you want to work with, or you will get nonsensical responses that are incredibly difficult to work through. So it's really difficult. So in RFPs, it's talking about high level of, these are our security principles, potentially referencing standards with some caution, because of course standards are not the most useful thing. And then when you start to whittle it down to, here are the 4 or 5 that we like, I think at that point, start having the more detailed conversations. But
Right.
if you send out here, here's 9,000 controls that we would like at the RFP, it's just going to cost you a massive amount of paperwork to process it, and it won't really help. That's
true, I suppose. Mike, I'm sure you, Extra Hop doesn't do smoke and mirrors and so on, but in terms of that, how on the other side of the fence, as it were, how stringent would you like people to be to say, look, we'll only really talk to you if you've got this, this, and this?
Well, from our perspective, I'll tell you, we wouldn't hide behind, a discussion or a document. We're always happy to engage with our prospects at that time or customers to have a discussion and really understand the requirements. But going from the other direction, I know you asked me from my direction. I would tell you that you have to go deeper with certain suppliers. If I had my crown jewels of all my donors in a third-party data source, I'm not sending out a questionnaire. I'm forensically, possibly even visiting this place to understand their best practices. And you obviously cannot do that with every supplier, but there's certainly certain parts of your infrastructure or your data set that you absolutely have to be at a different level than Cloud Security Alliance questionnaire or some standard contractual language.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this goes back to the Labour Party story we were talking about, doesn't it? Of the fact that, and again, you just stress we don't know what the data is, but it's important enough, as Mark said, to point out to the ICO. If that goes wrong and your supplier goes wrong, you potentially become a news story on Sky News, Mark. That's the risk, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is very much about that impact, and I think there are traditional methods of procurement of suppliers that on occasions don't work. I've been witness to a supplier refusing to give a certain piece of security assurance because it wasn't prescriptive enough in their contract. And it kind of beggars belief a little bit in this age where everybody's getting attacked and everybody's getting reputational damage as a result of it. So me as a buyer and my suppliers, could get an impact on their reputational damage. So why are we not all pulling together? I don't know of many other industries, actually. So speaking more generically about the IT industry, they don't really have a common goal other than selling more tin, software, enabling innovation, etc. As a security industry, we're all trying to achieve a common goal, which is to protect ourselves and our services. And so it's in conflict with that traditional procurement system, where I think that we should be talking more about outcomes rather than being prescriptive. There's only certain things that I would want my suppliers to tell me about. Have you got any material risks? Have you had any? Have you got any vulnerabilities that you're aware of? Have you been subject to a breach? If so, just pick up the phone and tell me. And I think Ed, you probably touched on it. Building those relationships and developing trust between the partners and various supply chain members, I think is really important.
And there is a point where it becomes a positive reputational thing, because as much as it wouldn't happen formally, if people think that all of the buyers of these services do not talk among themselves and go, yeah, they do it really well, they their security is top, you'd still do your own independent assessment, but it gets you a lot of referrals. Security is actually now a selling point, and being a cooperative supplier is a selling point.
Can I ask you about this as well? One thing that occurred to me was the extent to which this is driven, and you talked earlier about who's drawing up these questionnaires and so on. To what extent is some of this driven by lawyers? Because frankly, if it goes wrong, there will be legal ramifications, certainly compliance ramifications, regulations, and so on. That's the lawyer's remit, and I just wonder how much the lawyers' fingers are across this.
So a lot of it's driven by lawyers who are who get involved in the sort of contractual side of, and especially if you're a big enough buyer, you will supply the contract to the supplier, not the other way, or there'll be a lot of legal wrangling, and they get involved in it and about liability. But of course, that doesn't you can't outsource the impact. It's still going to happen to me as the buyer if it goes wrong. But I also see a lot of it driven by purchasing departments who are focused so much on cost, and they get told to sort of tack these security questions at the end of their 100 question financial questionnaire, and it's sort of driven by them. And Yeah, but the lawyers are absolutely involved, but it's also who processes the responses is the problem. Because if you get a deeply technical response, is a lawyer or the purchasing department the correct person to actually assess that?
And Mike, so are there any sort of tips for security people to get in earlier on that process, do you think?
Well, I think you got to start with, you have the program, the cyber resilience program. You look at your security program and you say, here are the things that we're going to do from a security process perspective. Here's how we've segmented our risk, segmented our data. And these are the principles that we have around, inspecting how we deal with that, number one, because then, if you do get to a contractual process, you have that program in place in order to revert back to and say, look, we have to get our security architecture team or someone else from the program that's maybe more technical to be able to ask those right questions to help the legal and procurement team. So to me, it starts with cleaning up with a program to start, so you can revert back to that and really pull people back to that, because a lot of times you'll get push and pull from either organization, and they might not be as effective if there isn't this standard of work that's expected there in this due diligence process.
Interesting. Mark, again, for you, any kind of tips in terms of getting security earlier in on this procurement bit?
I think so. I think it sounds perverse, but before engaging with a supplier, you've got to think about what happens when it goes wrong, and think about that planning activity. So a lot of organizations will create their incident management plan, and they'll look at their own services and they go, right, we will ask our suppliers to do this at this point during the process. But unless you've rehearsed that, properly in anger, and put people through the mill of what an incident might actually happen, how it will happen, it's difficult to appreciate that. So I think you've got to think about the worst case at the point that you're doing your procurement, because we've witnessed firsthand how people during an incident, a ransomware incident was the example I'm thinking of, where our customer just reverted to type. The CEO shouted more than you'd ever heard him shout before. The operations guys were shouting at their admins. The techies were doing their techie stuff in their own zone, and then the legal team, come in and say, no, this is what we're doing. And that you've got to think about those situations so that you can prepare for them. And particularly in supply chain, you cannot assume that your supply chain will react the way that you want them to. And so, from a procurement perspective, not suggesting you make it too complicated and, put people through pre-sales activities where, pre-tender processes where you've got to rehearse incidents, but you certainly got to think about it.
Yeah, interesting. Good stuff. I'm just aware we're butting up against time at the moment, so I will bring things to a bit of a close at the moment. Our teissTalk has very usefully stuck in the link for next week's episode, which is going to be not next episode, next week? Yes, next week, next Tuesday. I'm losing track of time. 9th of November, Jenny's going to be here talking about identity governance in a hybrid world, which is, again, one of those issues that keeps coming up and up on teissTalk. It'd be good to chat about that. So do tune in for that. No winners for the teissTalk mug today. Apparently nobody wanted to register their bike. But look, if you haven't done it, please do it. It's the way to solve bike crime. I am actually going to go out and put leaflets on bikes saying, please register this bike. Anyway, that's my plan. I will stop talking about that now. I will thank also our panelists for this. Been great to have you along, guys. Ed Hardy, Senior VP Cybersecurity at Alex Partners. Mark Avery, CISO and founder of Cyberchain Alliance, also co-founder, I think, of Cyber House Party, which is a great thing to get involved with. Do check that out. And also Mike Campfield, who is Vice President, International Operations and Global Security Programs at Extra Hop. Thanks to each of you. As I say, Jenny's back next Tuesday with Identity Governance and Hybrid Work World. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day, good day tomorrow, and a good weekend. Nice to see you all. See you on another teissTalk soon.
Yeah,
thank you.
Bye.